Hello, everyone, and welcome back as we complete our sixth chapter in the course on the French Revolution, today exploring the end of Napoleon and the collapse of his empire. Please title your notes for today, Napoleon's Empire Collapses. So this also concludes our third unit in the course as well that really spans from the age of absolutism until this era of revolutions. So we begin by talking about these monarchs, these kings and queens with absolute authority. We introduce the Enlightenment, this period of questioning why people's social conditions are as they are, and then ultimately this era of revolutions, Enlightenment thinking being channeled into rage and attacks and revolution and overthrowing the absolute monarchs of the past. Interestingly, the word revolution scientifically means 360 degrees, to go in a complete revolution or cycle. In history, we typically look at it as a radical change. But in the case of the French Revolution, it's really both of those things. Yes, it was radical and it was a massive change to society, but we also kind of end up where we left off with Napoleon being an emperor. But you'll see by the end of today's lesson, after the Congress of Vienna, we have a reestablishment of these old monarchies in Europe, and basically the monarchs trying to put society back together as it originally was. So just to show you once again, this is a map of Europe during the Napoleonic Wars from 1805 to 1813. So you can see the major players on the board here. Obviously, France is in the center of Europe. You can see the boats as part of Napoleon's continental system, and the red explosion markers are the major battles that took place during the series of wars. Once again, just to remind you about which countries are at play here, we have Russia, Prussia, Austria, France, Great Britain, and Spain. So just to set the stage and provide some interesting information, it's important to keep in mind that Napoleon was a very fragile person in terms of his endless fear or worry that his empire would collapse. He spends a lot of his time thinking about his own legacy and preserving what he thinks that he's built as this emperor of France and of Europe in his own eyes. He knows that he needs a son. His first wife, Josephine, fails to produce one. I know this seems like a reoccurring trend in our course. So he ultimately divorces her and forms an alliance with the Habsburgs of Austria. This is where things get really funny, in a historical way. He ends up marrying a woman named Marie Louise, who's actually the grandniece of Marie Antoinette. So it's amazing to think that the people of France abhorred Marie Antoinette as the symbol of the old regime, the old order. And, Napoleon is beloved by the French people, and he makes himself this absolute ruler, and then he ends up marrying the relative of Marie Antoinette. So it really does kind of become a full circle experience. And the people of France, after all of this bloodshed and revolution, kind of end up where they started off. It's also important to note that Napoleon was significantly older than Marie Louise. She was only 19 years old at the time of their marriage. So we're going to kind of just mention the fall of Napoleon, and then we'll double back and go through really how his empire falls apart. So Napoleon conquers a great deal of land. The Netherlands, parts of Italy, other European nations obviously declare war. He defeats Austria, he defeats Prussia, and then ultimately it's the attack on Great Britain where his empire starts to crumble and fall apart. Just like so many other empires of the past, think of Spain and King Philip II trying to invade during Queen Elizabeth's rule. Napoleon tries to invade Great Britain by sea, and his fleet is largely destroyed in the British Channel. This is the Battle of Trafalgar. This is showcased over here to the right. This is largely seen as Napoleon's final battle during his wars. The British Navy was superior. Napoleon ultimately folds. But to understand really how his empire falls apart, we have to take a step back and go through the entire picture. So Napoleon's undoing was largely caused by his own desire for power, and historians have divided his collapsing empire into three different phases. So you can number them 1, 2, and 3. So, number one is the so called continental system. In 1806, there's this massive blockade of European ports. Napoleon is basically trying to prevent his enemies from communicating with one another and also from trading with one another. A big part of this is also trade with the New World states. So he's trying to prevent the United States from sending supplies over to the European nations. The goal was to ruin Great Britain's economy, prevent them from obviously getting needed materials, both in terms of exports and imports. So, of course, the British fight back. Smuggling becomes a common practice both by the British as well as the French during this time. So the British form their own blockade of Europe. Basically, you have these two different lines of ships, some of them French, some of them British, and they're seizing any ships that go through. Americans become extremely angry about this because a lot of the time these ships that are patrolling the seas will abduct American boats, steal their possessions, and then enslave their crew. So the United States ultimately declares war on Great Britain. In U.S. History 1, you'll learn more about this, but basically, as part of Jay's Treaty, um, the United States says to both France and Great Britain, whichever one of you stops seizing our ships, we will start trading with the other one. So the French stop seizing American ships, and then the British keep seizing the ships. So the United States and Great Britain go to war. This becomes the War of 1812, which will last for 2 years until 1814. So, number two is the Peninsula War. So, in order to enforce this continental system or this blockade of Europe, Napoleon really needs Portugal to abide by his rules because it's on the coast of Europe. So, what he does is he invades through Spain. Spain was an ally. The Spanish people protest. And basically, Napoleon, in a fit of rage, how dare you defy me, replaces the Spanish king with his own brother. The Spaniards ultimately fight back, which obviously becomes a massive problem for Napoleon because now he's fighting a multi-front war. You'll see in a moment he ends up fighting against the Russians later in the Napoleonic series. Now he's fighting against Great Britain and then Spain as well. So it's multiple fronts instead of just one. His disregard for his allies is notable. Ultimately, he also wrongs the Germans and the Italians, and eventually both turn on him as well. Finally, this is often seen as Napoleon's biggest mistake, his invasion of Russia. Initially, the Tsar of Russia was Napoleon's ally, but he starts selling grain to the British because he knows he'll make a massive profit. Napoleon feels slighted, and because he also wants Poland and is angry at the Tsar of Russia, he basically declares war on Russia and then invades. He sends 422,000 French soldiers into Russia, leading them himself, not anticipating the brutal winter and brutal cold that he's going to encounter. A theme from history is that you don't invade Great Britain by sea and you don't invade Russia by foot. And in both instances, they become a massive problem for Napoleon. The Russians employ a military strategy known as scorched earth, which basically means that the soldiers burn everything in their path as they're retreating backwards toward Moscow, their capital. So as Napoleon is marching toward the capital himself, everything in terms of supplies and shelter are gone. So they have nowhere to camp, they have no food, and as time is going on, he's losing more and more of his men. Once Napoleon ultimately reaches Moscow, the Tsar orders the entire city burnt to the ground. So it's really a meaningless victory. Napoleon arrives and it's a pile of ash. Everyone has retreated and the Tsar is gone. So yes, you've conquered Russia, kind of, but there's nothing there to actually conquer. And now you've got nothing to do but turn around and go home. At the end of this march back and forth, only 10,000 men remain from the 422,000 who began, largely due to hunger, cold, and these Russian attacks, both leaving and coming out of Russia. So this chart highlights the path of Napoleon. You can see just how dramatically his forces decline. And again, a totally meaningless victory, and really his invasion of Russia was dominated only by his own lust for power and his own greed. Here you can see a depiction of Napoleon arriving only to find the city in flames. And of course, a painting of him returning home, looking defeated, and obviously, all of his soldiers are in despair. So, in terms of the fall of Napoleon, he only has a small army left after the invasion of Russia. His attack on Great Britain by sea seriously depletes his navy. He's also spread out his forces too thin as well because he's trying to blockade all of Europe. So, it's not very difficult by this point for the European nations to move in collectively from all of their different fronts and exile Napoleon from Europe. So, you may be thinking, Mr. Verdon, why not just kill Napoleon? So, the European nations follow a set of guidelines established for hundreds of years where executing a monarch or an emperor was really just a taboo practice. It simply was not done. I mean, the whole reason why the execution of Charles I and King Louis XVI were so dramatic was because that never happened. You don't execute your monarch. The common practice was to exile them. And as we've seen recently, executing a monarch very rarely serves the purpose that you're hoping for. It riles the public up. It creates a desire for vengeance. And interestingly, King Louis XVI's brother is given the throne, King Louis XVIII. And you can see here, this is called Napoleon's farewell to his imperial guard. One thing that's important to note is the legacy of Napoleon and the propagandization of his time in control of the country. Like, you'll see that the people of France love Napoleon and they try to replicate him in a lot of different ways. You can kind of think of it in the same way that people looked back to the Roman Empire with this nostalgia. They look back to the Napoleonic period kind of in the same way. And it's just incredible to see this portrait of Napoleon looking so defeated in comparison to really how we introduced him, as this very tough and calm and steady leader who would ascend to such power and then end in such a defeated way. This is a cartoon of him in his exile, looking at the continent of Europe from a distance. Interestingly, though, Napoleon does return to Europe from exile. This gets a little bit complicated, but as part of the treaty that ended the Napoleonic Wars, France was supposed to pay Napoleon on the island of Elba, where he was in exile, a certain amount of money to basically rule over this island by himself. The king refuses to pay, and Napoleon uses this as justification to return to Europe. When he does, he tries to reclaim France, and citizens rush to his aid. It's a short-lived campaign. It only lasts 100 days, hence the term the 100 Days. And he's defeated at the infamous Battle of Waterloo by both the British and the Prussians together. He's exiled again to the Isle of St. Helena, which is much farther away and much more difficult to actually return from. He dies 6 years later, lonely and isolated from the rest of Europe. This is a portrait of the 100 Days. You can see Napoleon here in action, and then a portrait of him being left on the Isle of St. Helena by himself. One thing that's important to note, just as a quick aside, this is how far the island is away from Europe, obviously much further away than Elba. It's important to note, though, that Napoleon was not necessarily like a prisoner. He was, just living in this estate on the island. He was exiled as a ruler or a monarch. So he died with dignity, just, in personal disgrace and in personal loneliness. One final note, it is really interesting to think of the propaganda and memory of Napoleon. Of course, in class, we learn about his horrifying defeat marching into Russia. But again, for the people in France, he becomes something of a legend. And they'll spend the next several decades looking very fondly on the Napoleonic period and trying to replicate this grand or glorious part of their past. So to wrap things up, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, European powers come together at the Congress of Vienna to discuss the restructuring of Europe. And basically, the goal was to undo Napoleon's conquests. There are several different aspects of this, so I just want you to list them out. Number one, they restore all the old boundaries from before Napoleon started taking over. All of the monarchs who have been removed from power, such as the King of Spain, are put back into power, put back into office. Coalition of countries would occupy France for 3 to 5 years. So basically, France is under the control of the European nations for this period of time. And then finally, the French are forced to pay 700 million francs as reparations for the damage Napoleon has done. Reparations are typically paid at the end of a war to cover the military costs of the winning side. Just to end things off, these were the key players at the Congress of Vienna and where all of these decisions are ultimately made. In our next chapter, we're going to be delving into the Industrial Revolution, which is really taking place simultaneously to a lot of other things that we've talked about so far in our class. But it's one of the major components that will lead us to Unit 5 on the era of the Great Wars. So we're first going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, the advancement of new military equipment, factory production. Then we'll talk about imperialism, the desire of nations to expand their borders, and then we'll be entering into World War I.